President Trump picked an experienced appellate court judge to fill the coming vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court.
It is my honor and privilege to announce that I will nominate Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court.
Kavanaugh, 53 years old, in theory could serve on the court for decades. He's been on the very high-profile appeals court in the District of Columbia for 12 years, once clerked for the retiring Justice Anthony Kennedy, who Kennedy's long been the deciding vote on an evenly divided court.
A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent.
Kavanaugh needs every vote he can get with a razor-thin Republican majority in the U.S. Senate. Democrats and liberal groups fear he could join other conservatives overturning the landmark Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion. David Coale is a constitutional law attorney in Dallas with the firm Lynn Pinker Cox Hearst. So there were 4 finalists. All of them were conservative.
Yes.
Where would Kavanaugh be on a spectrum of most to least conservative of those 4?
He's probably on the more conservative end. There are different kinds of conservatism, and he is on the more conservative end, in particular on how deferential you are to an administrative agency, IRS, something like that. He looks at what Congress said in the law telling what those agencies should go do, and not so much on the agency's process for implementing that.
Right.
And that places him with Justice Gorsuch on the more conservative end of judges that look at those issues.
But certainly this is not going to be the most conservative justice on the U.S. Supreme Court.
That's right. The man did clerk for Anthony Kennedy, after all.
Right.
And so that's a formative experience for him, and he goes forward from there. And in his time on the D.C. Circuit, he's been a guy that follows precedent, hasn't been making law.
Right. There are 2 different kinds of conservative. There is a political conservative, somebody who's in the White House or in the House or in the Senate, and there's a judicial conservative. Is there a difference?
Well, it's one of the interesting things about this candidate, Judge Kavanaugh, is he has been both. He's been in the political side in the White House, and he's been on the bench as a judicial conservative. The difference is results versus process. A political conservative looks to results. What policy is a good policy? A judicial conservative looks at the process. How do we go about making this decision? What do we look at? That's the task of a judge, is to take a situation somebody else made and try to sort through it and figure out the right result under the law.
He's called a construction. He looks at the words of the Constitution. Well, the Constitution has no words about the internet or cell phones or things like that.
Absolutely. Text, of course, you look at that, but you also have to look at the structure of it and the history of it to see how things got to be where they are. His opinions on the D.C. Circuit put a big emphasis on structure, how the different parts of the puzzle fit together. Even if we don't have words that speak directly to something like the internet, we do have words that define the branches of government. And his work on that court has been kind of puzzle pieces, putting those together and figuring out the right structure.
He worked in the George W. Bush White House and says that, and not in a legal opinion, but in a speech, that was a formative time for him that led him to the conclusion, which the President Trump certainly would like to have heard, that a sitting president cannot be indicted for a crime.
Yeah, it's a fascinating background, that issue. He spent a number of years working in the Bush administration after he had spent time working for Ken Starr as independent prosecutor during the Clinton administration. So he's seen the absolute extreme of both ends and appears to have come out on the side of greater executive power, obviously a very relevant issue in today's political climate.
He will inevitably be asked, and he inevitably will not answer his views on things like abortion and immigration. Could he answer those questions if he chose to?
He can certainly speak to what he has written before, because he has made some statements about those in his other opinions, but particularly for a judge like him that focuses on structure and particular words, he would be very uncomfortable, I think, speaking to a case without knowing all the facts about how it got to be there, who's bringing it, all those details that go into building up the full picture.
And he will be asked, the senators are going to try some way to get him to answer something of substance, and one of the questions will be, if Roe versus Wade came before you, Judge Kavanaugh, how would you decide today? Can he answer that?
Probably not. Because a principled answer to that question depends on who's bringing the case, what the restriction is at issue, and a number of other questions that are very important, both constitutionally and as a matter of, I think, the way he sees the world.
This court, very divided, has chosen over the last several years to take a lot of opinions and be very narrow. People
Yes.
will expect this is going to be this broad landmark decision, and they will decide it on the narrowest of technicalities and leave the big questions unanswered. Now that it's a more conservative court, do you expect it to take a more definitive stance?
There are two different things at issue there. On the one hand, you have 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and if you have 9 different opinions, that's not very useful. Right. You have to try and find some common ground. And certainly now you may have more room to find that among the 5 conservative judges. On the other hand, judicial conservatives by their nature don't like to have an expansive role of the federal courts in things that they believe are the area for the Congress or for the executive. Right. So that's part of the impulse for these small decisions, is to stay in bounds, not be stepping on other people's toes.
Okay, and recognize that there are 3 branches.
Exactly, the whole point of structure.
Right. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Anytime.